Good evening and welcome to this episode 45 of the South African Equestrian Federation's podcast From the Horse's Mouth. My name is Georgie Roberts, and tonight it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Alex Miszweski. Let me just make sure that I get this right. The CEO and founder of Novita Biotechnology and Regenesis Vet, who's coming to speak to us tonight about regenerative medicine in equestrians, or rather in equines. Equestrians, I don't think we've quite got the handle on yet, Alex, but I'm looking forward to that as a rider myself. Thank you so much for joining us in the studio tonight, all the way from Cape Town.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
It's really, really exciting to speak to you about this. It's just such an interesting aspect of the space at the moment and really the future, I think, for so many sport horses, right?
There's so much going on, I think, both in the human and equine space, that it's an incredibly exciting environment to work in. And there is just so much innovation happening that, you think you've made progress, and the next thing you know, there's even more things happening.
Yeah,
So it's really, really great.
And it's really something, I think, because you say that, worth keeping our eye on constantly.
Absolutely.
So, Alex, won't you mind just taking us quickly through the definition of what regenerative medicine actually entails for sport horses?
So, regenerative medicine is essentially the process of replacing or regenerating damaged cells, tissues, or organs in order to establish normal function. So in the context of sports horses, that often involves leveraging off the body's ability to heal itself.
Okay. And this is, of course, an interesting story that I love. How did you get involved or interested in this space?
So just a disclaimer, I'm not a vet or have a veterinary background whatsoever. I actually come from quite a strong finance background. I very much so...
Which is ironic for someone who likes horses because, you should know better.
Yeah, I know. That's the only thing I definitely have never got right. But I sort of got into the space in a very unconventional way. So I, from quite a young age, have been involved in a few different biotech startups, some of which had a veterinary focus. And in the process of all of that, I had my darling horse, many of which know is called Emma, who sustained a career-ending injury. And we actually tried a lot of the regenerative medicine, treatments we will sort of discuss tonight. And unfortunately, nothing really worked. A lot of them worked, but there wasn't a positive clinical effect for long enough to justify long-term a career. And eventually it got to the point where I was told the horse had to be retired. And I just thought, absolutely not. That's not how this is going to work. And luckily, through some of the networks I had through some of those other companies I'd been involved in, I managed to find a very, very passionate group of people who were committed to trying to help me. So the idea was never, ever to start a company. It literally was just to help Emma.
And as a good finance person, you ended up starting a company to do that.
And after Emma sort of made a full recovery, and, I sort of just went back to...
And eventually got to the point where I had so many people reaching out to me asking for help. It's sort of heard me in the story. But you have to find it, fortunately, I said, well, there's clearly an opportunity here. Maybe do something about it. And for the past 5 years, I've been involved in the development and commercialization of a number of different regenerative medicine treatments. So that's how I sort of got into the space.
And thank you to Emma. I mean, isn't that
fantastic? Emma is just an angel.
So to begin with, Regenesis Vet, and big fan of your team for the United League of Champions, by the way, is the only preventative treatment that I've seen. Why is preventative treatment so important when it comes to horses?
So I think we'll discuss sort of within regenerative medicine, you have products that are targeted at controlling inflammation and actually regenerating. So in the context of regenerative medicine as a whole, Regenesis Vet is definitely the only preventative treatment that exists to date. The importance of prevention when it comes to horses is, from an evolutionary point of view, horses are animals of prey. So their bodies are designed to hide injuries up until the point where they literally cannot hide them anymore, and that then presents as lameness. So by the time your horse is actually lame, there's a certain period of, in a lot of cases, of damage that's been going on.
Massive pathology.
Exactly. Leading up to that point, and then it gets to the point where it's so bad that symptomatically the horses cannot hide it anymore. And the reason that sort of process naturally exists is because in the wild, if the horses were to show sign of injury as soon as they started, they'd be easy prey for predators.
We actually had Dr. Rissa Parker on the podcast recently, and she was saying how horses, things can be going badly wrong, and they'll keep eating because they're going like, I'm fine, I'm eating something. And we also obviously had Sue Dyson on, and she speaks great, wonderfully about the 24 behaviors of pain, which she sees as a precursor to actual unsoundness, to your point. Exactly.
Like they might, like a flinch is not a lameness to us, but it actually is telling you that something's there.
100%. And quite interestingly, I think the official statistic from some of the research they've done on tendons, as much as 85 to 90% of tendon injuries have actually had a preclinical stage before those tendons actually go.
So the horse was going basically on a subclinical injured leg. Sure.
And I mean, if you think what we expect our horses to do, to go down banks like with Derby this next week, to jump over these huge jumps, the amount of force you need for a tendon to just go like that, it's really, really difficult.
So the horses are basically, like a lot of the time, by the time we're getting to a bad injury, there's actually been something niggling.
Exactly.
That's interesting. I suppose it's also a case then for owners not to ignore.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The better you know your horse and the better you can identify signs of pain or discomfort or changed patterns, starting to jump to the left or right, not wanting to jump nicely into combinations, a whole lot of different things. Obviously, I'm a show jumper, so I'm coming more from the show jumper.
No, but that's really interesting. And we often hear this dialogue that like the horse is naughty and
often there's a lot more. There are some naughty horses on the first day.
anyone who's had a pony is like, no, they are devils.
With those.
What are some of the most common injuries that you're seeing in horses that are good candidates for regenerative medicine?
So generally, you're looking at your musculoskeletal injuries. So soft tissue injuries, those include tendons, ligaments, suspensories, muscles. And then, of course, osteoarthritis and joint injuries. Those are sort of your main areas in which regenerative medicine has been extensively used.
That's great. And I mean, those are all, as you spoke about career ending, but I think as soon as any of those start, when you get your first hint of that, most owners are already thinking worst case scenario. You're thinking that's where it goes to from there. Okay, so now we were just discussing this before we went on air, and of course everyone's IRAP and PRP focused, but what are the different regenerative medicines that are available for sport horses? And additionally, if we can discuss how each of them work, what the mechanism is.
Okay, so I like to put them into two quite distinct categories. You have regenerative medicine products that are targeted at reducing inflammation, and you've got regenerative medicine products that are actually fundamentally regenerative in nature, and they're not the same. So if you look at sort of your autologous conditioned serum type product, so those are things like IRAP, ProStride, A2M, essentially what those are trying to do, or actually maybe I can go through them one by one. That group of products are essentially, their function is to control and limit inflammation.
So those are your autologous products.
So almost all, in the context of equine, almost all our regenerative medicine products are autologous, and that means same donor, same recipient.
Okay.
With the exception of stem cells, which can be autologous, but often are allogeneic. So one horse will donate its stem cells, and that will be administered to a different recipient.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, and that's allogenic.
Yeah,
okay.
Allogeneic.
Okay.
So in terms of something like IRAP, so IRAP stands for interleukin-1 receptor antagonist protein. Now, in the context of joint injuries, osteoarthritis, and in general inflammation in horses within that context of a joint, one of the big pro-inflammatory proteins that is probably the most popular for causing havoc is a protein called interleukin-1. So IRAP is essentially a process where you take blood, you incubate it, you do a whole lot of other things to it, and you create an antagonist to this really detrimental interleukin-1.
Like an antidote.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it neutralizes the receptor in order to basically take away that inflammation. So from a mechanism of action, that's essentially how IRAP works. ProStride, we don't really use very much of it in South Africa. It's unfortunately very expensive. That's a really nice hybrid between IRAP and PRP.
Okay.
So you've got this sort of anti-inflammatory effect of IRAP, but you've actually got a regenerative aspect in the
that's
PRP
interesting.
angle in it.
And it's the only reason we don't use it because of the cost.
The cost, I'm not quite sure if it's registered here.
Oh, okay. All right.
So that might be a factor as well.
Okay.
A2M also works similar to IRAP. That's a newer product. And then you've got...
What is A2M?
It's alpha-2 macroglobulin. So that's a newer molecule. It also it doesn't have a regenerative effect, but it's got a very, very good anti-inflammatory effect. And I think it's quite interesting. Often there's this whole debate, like, what is the best regenerative medicine treatment? And I personally think that's totally the wrong way to look at it. I think it's the case of what is best for the horse
of course,
that you're dealing with.
That's kind of like saying to people, like, well, what's the best medicine? I don't know. Do you have diabetes or anemia?
Well,
you know?
exactly.
If you have one and you take the other medicine, you're in trouble.
I think all these regenerative medicine treatments have very, very good legitimate uses in the right case. And there's never, ever, ever a product that does exist or will exist that is suitable for every case.
No, of course, yeah.
So if we look at the more sort of regenerative side of the treatments that are available, these ones are generally not great at controlling inflammation, but they're really, really good at regeneration. Okay. So the big ones are PRP, which essentially works through making sure you've got a threshold number of platelets that you hope will eventually release enough cytokines and growth factors to have a clinical effect. And those cytokines and growth factors are instrumental in different things. So they drive different biological processes, which drive...
Such as?
So tissue regeneration, a process which I'll talk just now with Regenesis, a big one is angiogenesis, and a number of different other things.
PRP is, of course, famous with women for the vampire facial now.
Good old Kim Kardashian.
So she's done her bit for PRP. So okay, that's interesting. So
PRP is actually quite a controversial one. I think part of I don't want to say the problem with PRP, because in the right setting it has a very, very good place and use. I think the big problem with PRP is you've got not a million, but realistically there's about 200 different commercial kits you can use to prepare it.
Wow.
And there's no standardization whatsoever. So one kit you'll get a factor of 2, like a 2-fold increase in your baseline platelets. Another will have a 50-fold increase.
So it really depends.
And depending on what you're doing, is it leukocyte rich? Is it leukocyte poor? Which essentially there's a whole debate which is better. There's a whole lot of different considerations. So if you look at a published paper of PRP, you can have 3 different published papers and you get 3 different.
Depends,
depending on what kit they've used and how they've used it, and there's a lot of considerations. Other regenerative ones is stem cell therapy, which I'm sure many people know. Bone marrow aspirate concentrate, not very many people speak about that. No. It's much more so used in Europe and America than here. I haven't heard of many people using it here. And then, of course, Regenesis.
So tell us about Regenesis Vet Riyadh.
So Regenesis Vet Riyadh is the only regenerative medicine product that currently exists in the world that is given systemically. There are some stem cell therapies that are given systemically, but the way they're regulated and the way they sort of work are a little bit different. So Regenesis is similar to PRP in the sense that the active ingredients that are sort of being derived from the blood are from the platelets, but rather than trying to concentrate as many platelets as possible, you're trying to access a lot of the growth factors and cytokines that are present in a place within the platelets called your alpha granules. So you actually want those platelets to degranulate to the point where you can access enough of those really good growth factors and cytokines, and then in very, very high volumes reintroduce those to the horses systemically.
That's amazing.
And interestingly, with Regenesis, the best place to use it is with a horse that's got an active injury. because when you've given all these growth factors back to the horse, the whole idea is it's less so to do most likely actually with that injection and more so to do with the cascade effect that that injection triggers. So if you now flood the horse's body with growth factors that are only naturally present in very high concentrations after injury, you sort of trigger a whole lot of other biological processes that you would naturally have after injury.
That's incredible.
So that's the whole way from like a preventative point of view. If you can trigger a healing cascade before a horse is clinically lame, you potentially can actually have an intervention whilst you're in that potentially preclinical stage where the horse is susceptible to injury. So if the horse overjumps and hurts it, or not hurts, but overdoes it with its glute a bit, instead of that turning into a chronic glute injury, it's not always the case, but you potentially can give that horse's body the resources to come out of that before it comes chronic.
Healing.
But what you would need is increased blood flow to an area of injury in order for these growth factors to be directed there. So we leverage off known documented biological processes. You can't, have a horse that's standing in a paddock, doesn't have an injury, and expect it to go to the left hind fetlock. There's got to be some underlying biological process that's directing increased blood flow and resources to that area.
And then with a horse that's undergoing Regenesis vet treatment, what is the management protocol? Like, would you have to keep moving them to kind of keep redirecting everything to that?
So what we generally see, horses that are not in work, unless there's like quite a big injury that is fresh that we can intervene early, don't really benefit.
That's
I think for a number of reasons. So based off some of those physiological processes we described earlier, those are mostly in play when you've got a horse that's in work and is sort of in a more anabolic state in terms of what you're asking its body to do.
Yeah.
The sort of balance between breaking down muscle and building up. That's really where Regenesis, I think, is.
It's just interesting, like how horse rehabilitation has changed over the years, whereas before you used to lock them in a box, forget about them a little bit. And this is leading me on to the next point. There's been an interesting study out, which you told me about, where horses with serious lamenesses left for a year without treatment, so just rest, then brought back into work would typically be lame again within 7 months.
More than 70% of horses that had quite serious lamenesses, 2 out of 5 to 3 out of 5 upwards, left off for a year without treatment, within 1 month. Being exercised, and most of those horses didn't even get to the stage where they were exercised, but they were still lame. Out of that entire group, more than 70% of horses were still lame. So
we're moving away from this.
We're moving away from
them standing.
Just rest the horse and do nothing. If you're going to rest the horse, my opinion is do something proactive in the meantime, because damaged tissue without sort of active regeneration. And there's only so much resources a body will allocate to an injury. And once it's sort of done what it normally does, if it's not enough, you need to intervene more in order to get the horse back to where it was.
Yeah, absolutely. That is so interesting. 70%. I mean, that's really just incredible. What are the potential benefits of using regenerative medicine compared to, and I want to say traditional treatments, but also just traditional approaches? It's not necessarily, it's the wait and see approach sometimes as well,
So I think the biggest difference with regenerative medicine, it's a bit what I touched on previously. So with traditional treatments, all you really are doing is symptomatic management.
Plastering over the damp in the corner.
Exactly. And sometimes that plaster is enough to break an inflammation cycle and the horses totally come out of it, and then you don't need any further intervention. But I think what we're asking sports horses to do these days, it's a different level to what horses, generally speaking, were biologically designed to do. You have the best of the best of the best horses. I was listening to a really interesting talk by Ludger Beerbaum, and we've actually done quite a bit of work with him and his vet. And the best of the best of the best horses, from like a genetics point of view, are so strong that they often don't need intervention. But that's the exception. That's the most elite of elite of elite athletes. And for most of the rest of our horses,
like
they
that,
need a
yeah.
little bit of help along the way. You know, those are the horses that go jump 5 Longines Global
Yeah,
Champions
yeah. I mean, it's
tour
crazy.
classes, have 2 days off and get to do it all over again. But again, that's the exception to the rule. So with traditional treatments, we've gone from sort of symptomatic management to actually fixing the problem with regenerative medicine treatments. So as I mentioned earlier, there sort of are 2 groups. You've got your group of treatments that control inflammation. And if you look, you know, these days at horses that have laminitis that, you know, you can't use cortisone on, or you're very cautious about triggering or something flaring up again, I think regenerative medicine has got a very legitimate use. I think also because you're addressing the problem more at the source. So if you're looking at like a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory or cortisone for an inflamed joint, you know, it sort of works through, the technical term is you're interfering with the cyclooxygenase of what's happening in that joint. But a more, in my opinion, targeted way is using something like IRAP that actually blocks those receptors. So you tend to get a much more durable response for longer, and you have better long-term outcomes. I think
So it's also taking all of those inflammatory processes out, just prevents further degradation. It's, you know.
Exactly. So I think with something like IRAP, I think people often are under the illusion that it's regenerative. If there's any regenerative effect you get, it's a fact of the body being able to normalize and do a little bit more because you've removed the inflammation. IRAP in and of itself, there's very little regenerative power. But your things that control inflammation, IRAP, A2M, Prostride to some extent, cortisone, the horse looks better in a week's time or a few days' time, but you're not developing a fundamentally stronger, better structure.
That's great. That's a lovely difference.
If you look at something like PRP, Regenesis, again, Prostride to some extent, that's a bit of a hybrid. Your horse isn't going to look, if it's lame, better in a week's time, but in 2-3 months' time, you're going to have a totally different tendon, you're going to have a totally different structure, if you have enough threshold platelets and all these different problems with these treatments, but you're going to end up with a much improved structure or joint. So in my opinion, from what we see and from what the research says, I think the best possible protocol you can have is first and foremost getting the inflammation under control. I'm a big proponent of regenerative medicine, so using something like IRAP. And then once that inflammation is under control, following up with something regenerative that's actually going to improve whatever underlying weakness you have.
So it's not a one, like you were saying early on, it's not well, this is the best one. It's what's best for the injury and the horse.
Exactly.
Okay.
And for instance, like quite interestingly, we do a lot of work in the Middle East, both with the racehorses, and there's a huge endurance market there. And IRAP historically has only really been used in joints. And now what they've started doing is combining IRAP and shockwave in tendon injuries.
That is really
and they're getting
interesting.
really, really good results. So obviously we'll follow it up with something like PRP or Regenesis or something like that. But injury generally has an inflammatory component to start off with.
So this is what. So typically you would get your injury in your horse. That creates inflammation in the area. First solution: get the inflammation under control. Then go in with your actual solution.
Yes, then go in and regenerate.
That's
great.
great.
And I think, we've got such good vets in this country. The best place to be guided is by your vet for your horse. I don't think regenerative medicine is entirely necessary in every case as the first line of defense, depending on what's happening and what your goals are. If you've got a horse that's a little bit older, its joints just flared up, and you need a jump in 2 weeks' time, provided the cortisone or whatever that your vet wants to use has an appropriate withdrawal. In my opinion, the most guaranteed way you're going to have to get that horse jumping sound in 2 weeks' time is most likely cortisone.
But it's interesting that, we often feel this, I don't want to, immediate gratification or short-term priority. And obviously, if it's your last opportunity to jump derby, perhaps, on your older horse, it's a different discussion. But looking towards longevity of our athletes.
Regenerative medicine is 100%
amazing.
the way to go.
Oh,
So I think there's very legitimate uses for all these things in different cases. I think there are still some cases where your traditional treatments still do have a place. I think a big factor comes down to cost and the accessibility and affordability of some of these treatments. But I think the most important is to have a vet that's got both your and your horse's interests at heart, and especially when it comes to your horse, not what's going to make this the best horse in the next month, what is the best for this horse's longevity and this career.
and I think that's actually really lovely. Obviously, our sport is under a spotlight at the moment, and doing the best thing for the horse possible is just, it must be a consideration. Are there any specific eligibility criteria or factors for sport horses that qualifies them as a suitable candidate specifically, going on from this last discussion?
So I think you sort of have to evaluate it on a case-by-case basis. I think with regenerative medicine, it generally has proven to be most suitable for mild to moderate injuries. Unfortunately, if a horse sustains like a really, really bad shattered cannon bone.
Well, I mean, we're not Harry Potter. We can't grow a bone
exactly.
back.
Well, I mean, we're working on it.
give me 2 years. I'll be
give
back.
Give me a few years.
Yeah.
But with a lot of these treatments, if you're looking at your catastrophic injuries, you're going to have a different approach for those injuries. Or either if there's something that can be done, it's often more in the line of surgery or something much more extreme, and then maybe later.
But to your point, very often, I mean, unless it's trauma-based, these catastrophic injuries, and it's trending with racing at the moment. There was Maple Leaf Mel who had this terrible accident in the States, and, it is coming under a spotlight, and I would be interested I mean, there's no way of tracking it, obviously, but how many of these horses were presenting subclinically? Is that the big question in the space?
I think that is a big question. I don't know how we solve it though.
Yeah.
I think, it's. Is
there any way to identify like horses they're not presenting as lame? Like, how do you?
I think unfortunately a lot of it comes down to cost and the extent to which you're going to do diagnostics and a whole lot of other things. Because if a horse is presenting 1 out of 5 lame on its front right a week and a half before a race, it could be something where, depending on how much money you want to spend,
could have stubbed its toe.
Well, exactly, but it also could be a case of it's just a bit of a flare-up, the horse got jarred up in training, the horse is treated with something like cortisone or IRAP or whatever, and the horse is good to go. Now, a horse that's got something much more serious but subclinical could present very, very similarly.
Interesting, okay.
So I think it's a case
so always
of
hindsight is 20/20 with
hindsight
horses.
is a perfect science. And I think the sport is getting better at, from an evaluation point of view, picking up high risk cases more often. There's a lot of interesting diagnostic technology. There's an interesting scanner called the UTC scanner that can actually pick up fiber disruption before a tendon goes, that sort of thing. So I think with an increase in that type of screening, I think we're moving towards a much safer future for horses. And what I would expect you would see, I think it's going to take time, but I think in the next 10 years, if a lot of the sport is going to survive, particularly in racing and things like that, I think you're probably going to see a lot of sort of that type of screening being more mandatory.
Amazing. Okay.
And I must say, we've done quite a lot of work with, the racing industry and a lot of these industries that I really do quite strongly feel unfairly get a bad rep. It's 2 or 3 bad eggs that taint the name of 200 other people that are trying to do a good job.
We also only need one catastrophic accident on TV to make the whole sport. Look at pentathlon was a wonderful example.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that was the end of it.
So, I think there are a certain percentage of injuries that your horse can break its leg in the paddock tomorrow. Do you know what I mean? That just by nature of horses being horses are totally and utterly unpreventable. And I think it's sad because I think often some of the times what's put a spotlight on, particularly in racing, are often those types of cases. And I mean, we've seen it with horses where you go back and look at their veterinary history that's sent to us, and there literally are no red flags.
Exactly. That's
Often
incredible.
there are cases where there are, but in a lot of these catastrophic injuries they've seen, at least with the information that, when you go back and look at it retrospectively, there's nothing that
crazy,
jumps
yeah.
out of you and said, oh, if only they would have done something here.
And that's your point, them being this prey animal, they're just perfectly designed to pretend everything's okay.
Yeah.
Really tricky. And I want to say, this is a preface to this. Is what are some of the biggest challenges with regenerative medicine, which leads us to the cost of regenerative medicine compared to other more traditional treatment options, and are there insurance considerations or options for equestrians?
So I think what we see, regenerative medicine at this stage on a per treatment basis often is more expensive than some of your traditional treatments. I think the way we try look at it in sort of some of the human medicine stuff, like you call it like the healthcare economics of what you're trying to achieve. So, one or two really effective regenerative medicine treatments that achieve the desired effect versus having to go back, get your vet out 6 extra times, retreating the same joint with cortisone, lost training times, the cost of replacing.
The cost of replacing a horse.
We've seen what it costs to
We
replace a horse.
all think like, oh, this is an expensive treatment, not as expensive as another show jumper.
Not as expensive as another show jumper, 100%. So I think if you look at the bigger picture, often in the long run, regenerative medicine treatments work out more cost effective.
And more effective.
And more effective, absolutely. It's quite difficult to give a comment on insurance considerations. From what we've seen, it varies a lot from insurance company to insurance company and also within insurance companies policy-wise. We have been quite lucky with, I must say, particularly in Europe with Regenesis, we've on quite a few occasions got some pretty significant
support
volumes of treatments
That's
reimbursed.
Great. It makes sense for the insurance companies to do a treatment that's going to have longevity, as opposed to, looking after a joint that comes back every 6 months or 8 months, and it only gets more frequent, right? If there is an issue at hand, it doesn't, unless you're regenerating.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
100%.
Now, something that's going to get you excited. Are there ongoing research or developments in the field of regenerative medicine and that are going to impact the application in sport horses? Alex was so excited about this when I asked her
So
initially.
I think this is something that myself, sort of within the space is really excited about, and also sort of as a company we're really excited about. And I think that is the potential for gene therapies in horses, particularly in the context of osteoarthritis. So at this stage, from a regulatory point of view, gene therapy is not allowed in horses.
And why is that? What is the official?
So I think it's to do with this fear of this unfair advantage, and I think we are just reaching the tip of what is possible with gene therapies. I think in some of the jurisdictions, if you look at the legislation really, really carefully, you can sort of interpret it, or some of the lawyers who've looked at it have said, in a regenerative medicine context with special permission, potentially it'll be allowed. My view is within
such a vague.
No, I know. Although everything regulation-wise with gene therapy is vague.
Okay.
But I think gene doping is more of the issue. They've sort of identified certain genes that are involved in performance, and now if you're going to edit horses' DNA to run faster, you can just imagine the number of problems.
I think we should do it. I want to see how fast a horse can go. Why
Ooh,
not? At least you're your own boss. I can't get you fired, Alex.
Yeah, it is one of the benefits. It is one of the benefits.
Yeah.
But I think where the regulation is going to have to catch up to the research is in the context of gene therapy and the potential it holds for arthritis. So
and surely well-being.
And well-being, but I think it's always a fine line, because whenever you've got a tool that is that powerful, there's always the risk of it being abused.
Of course, yeah.
And I think that's sort of the fine line you have to walk. But osteoarthritis, both in an equine setting and obviously also in a human setting, is one of the biggest unmet clinical needs that exist.
No, there's not really any treatment, right? There's just, I mean, when I say treatment,
Symptomatic management.
Exactly.
Symptomatic
That's it,
management
yeah.
and things like knee replacements.
Yeah.
Sort of a few things you can do here and there, and then really, really invasive, massive interventions. So one of the models that sort of is already in the process of being researched and there's some early validation for is basically, as I think we mentioned earlier, one of the biggest pro-inflammatory proteins that are involved, especially in horses in the case of osteoarthritis, humans also, is this interleukin-1, which is a pro-inflammatory protein. So there is a certain gene that exists that is responsible for producing the protein that is the antagonist to that bad protein, so the protein that would neutralize it.
Okay.
So in the context of gene therapy, you would be taking this targeted gene, or this gene you're trying to target, and you deliver it into the cells of the affected joint through the use of a viral vector, which is just like a delivery mechanism.
Incredible.
And then the idea is that with
envelope.
this, exactly, it's envelope. The idea is that with this gene delivery system, you would introduce this gene that would neutralize inflammation into the cells. For the people who did biology, DNA gets transcribed into RNA, and the end result is a protein is expressed. And what you'd have is the expression of this protein that would be an antagonist for this interleukin-1. So it's basically, and these cells would just pump out that protein. So you'd basically be injecting or delivering a target gene into the cells of a joint that would pump out IRAP.
That's
on
incredible.
an ongoing basis. And I think when you get into the realm
it becomes
of
its own little
that,
ecosystem.
Exactly.
I mean, that's incredible.
When you get into the realm of that type of regenerative medicine, I think there's a very high probability of seeing curative type responses.
That's incredible.
I think it's too early to tell sort of, is it going to be a one and done type therapy? Will it need multiple doses? But
I mean, there are a lot of equestrians. I think the majority of equestrians have a bit of arthritis somewhere in their bodies. You know,
there's
very exciting.
There's a company in the States called Regenesis that's already got a gene therapy candidate for this in phase 2 clinical trials. And they did, I stand to be corrected, I think it was with the University of California. Their preclinical model was done in horses for this type of gene therapy. So, the sort of very basic proof of concept is out there, and I think that's the type of
future
of innovation.
We have to look forward to.
I think when we first had IRAP, however many decades
and
it was ago,
I was about to say,
that was amateur hour, and now we're just going into a totally different
It's just
realm of
exponential,
possibility.
right, though? I mean, you blink and there's a new progression.
I think sort of, the sort of discovery and the subsequent development of these gene editing tools, CRISPR, base editing, prime editing, microRNA, it's unlocked a totally different level of opportunity and potential intervention. I mean, we're seeing in the human side diseases that were previously uncurable being cured with 95% success rates. It's unbelievable.
It's just so exciting, and I think all of us, anyone who's been around horses for any length of time, has had that special horse that's just never came back. And I mean, it's so amazing. There's a lovely meme that's going around on Facebook at the moment that says, if you could go and saddle up any of your horses that you've ever had again, they're all in a barn. Like, who would? And I just think this is really amazing. I mean, this is and the ongoing lasting impacts for breeding projects and things, Alex, are phenomenal.
It's huge. I think it's always going to be a balance, though, of can we make these therapies affordable and accessible to the horses and the people that need it most. And I think that is one of the big drivers around Regenesis. We also now are, through other sort of companies and structures, but affiliated still, are also looking at going into humans for a lot of these types of problems in the sort of cell and gene therapy space. And I think the big question is, it's going to come down to affordability and accessibility. And we've got a lot of work to do to get there.
Absolutely. I think also, though, if we look at, a century ago when cars were becoming mainstream, would it ever be affordable? And it does happen.
With innovation cost curves, it does. There's quite a interesting sort of, I always forget the name. I think it's Moore's law spelled backwards. So Eulem's law or something like that. And it's basically, as time has gone on, the cost to develop drugs have actually got more expensive.
That's
so
incredible.
opposite of tech, with like innovation cost curves, and like economies of scale, things have got
And
a
why
lot
is
better
that,
and
Alex?
cheaper. I think it's
Supply.
no, I wouldn't say it's a function of supply and demand. I think in part it's we've made so much innovation, like to date, to discover new drugs, new compounds. Technology's
going
got
like that.
cheaper.
It's not okay.
It's become easier. I mean, you can start a
technology's going
tech
the other
company
way.
with
It's,
$1,000 these days.
Yeah.
If you want to start a biotech company, you need to raise $1.5 million.
Oh, that's interesting.
So I think it's
becoming more refined, more
it's-
specific.
And I think, though, having said that, I think this whole area of genomics and how that's going to play into like a digital biology sense, I think you may see some reversion, but it's unbelievably expensive to develop a drug. And I think you've got to really, really have affordability and accessibility at the forefront if that's a priority. Because from a reimburser's point of view, especially in what we see like in the human side, if you have something like what we've seen with some of the cell and gene therapies we've got for like hemophilia A, all those sort of things, where you really had sickle cell disease, you really had nothing else. You've now got a $2.5 million gene therapy that will cure people who previously had an incurable disease, and the insurance companies are having to pay for it. So, if it's not really I'm not saying it's not a priority, it's a priority for everyone, I think, who's in the space, because we want to cure and help as many patients as possible. But if you know that insurance is going to pay for it,
it gives you
you really got to go the extra mile
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things that I think have to be balanced.
It sounds incredibly depressing. I know I can see you being
but
it's legitimate.
I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's tough that there are, I think, a select number of people that are being cured, but the fact we're curing people that previously you could never help is unbelievable. Another example is what's sort of happening in cancer with CAR T-cell therapy. Patients that had leukemia and lymphoma, so certain blood cancers that, had gone through chemo, radiation, monoclonal antibody therapy, nothing had worked. You're seeing 90% cure rates for some of these cancers. We've got the first CAR T trial starting in South Africa.
Really?
Yeah.
That is so exciting.
In the next few months, hopefully. So that's going to be a massive step in the right direction from a South African point of view.
That is so interesting. We'll have
They're busy, I think, enrolling now.
That's incredible.
Some of the people we work with are to some way, shape,
that
or
is so
form
exciting.
involved.
There's just so many good stories going around if you can get your hands on the right people.
No, there's so much innovation in the space, and I think a big thing is, from a developing economy's point of view, is we just need to make sure that we're not left behind.
I think it's a massive.
These therapies have been curing people in the States and Europe for in excess of 5 years already.
That's really, and the
And
developing
most people
countries
here haven't even heard of it. So
if you're on LinkedIn and you follow the Gates Foundation, and this discrepancy between first world and third world is a massive talking point at the moment. So you've mentioned Ludgerbeerbaum, you've mentioned the Middle East and some racehorses and endurance horses. Are there any particularly exciting success stories?
Oh, there's many. I think not. In terms of horses, big names we can speak about for a number of different confidentiality reasons. But I think at the end of the day, healthier, stronger athletes, they're going to perform better, they're going to have more longevity career-wise, and you're going to have a low risk of re-injury. I think some of, for instance, the tendon injuries we used to see that were catastrophic, I think you're seeing more and more of those horses, or at least a much higher percentage than previously, come right. Often they need like quite a serious amount of intervention, but there's still so many good things that are happening. I think the chance of a horse that's got an injury that regenerative medicine is suitable for, like coming back, is tenfold higher than if you looked at what the options were a few decades ago.
And really exciting. And it
really exciting.
Must be very special to also just, based on your experience also with Emma, to see other people having that experience. That's great.
I think it's probably my biggest driver and why I'm just so incredibly passionate about the space. I think seeing firsthand how medical innovation can totally change the outcome of a situation, and in some cases that's, to the extent of the difference between life and death.
Yeah.
And being able to be sort of involved in that process and involved in the creation, development, and commercialization of therapies that really can totally change the outcome for a certain group of people, horses, animals. It's I think I've got the most rewarding job in the world.
I remember speaking to somebody and saying, what was the most exciting horse or a client that you've worked with? And they said it's not going to be the big name that you think it's going to be. It's not the horse that goes to the Olympics.
It's
that
little
special
girl that calls you saying, my horse, we thought we were going to have to retire it. We did X, Y, and Z. Your product helped us, and I've got my best friend back. No, I'm going to start crying.
But I mean, that's ultimately why we all do it, right?
Absolutely.
We love the horse first and the sport second. What is the expected time frame from treatment to seeing results with horses?
So I think it really depends on a case-to-case basis, and I think it also depends on what interventions you're doing. So it's a bit of that inflammation versus regeneration. If you've got a horse that's in a tendon and it's not doing very well, and you treat it with a whole lot of regenerative medicine things, for instance, like PRP, which is a very sort of commonly used intervention for tendon injury, it's unlikely that from that particular treatment the horse is going to look better in a week's time. But the quality of your tendon repair in 2-3 months' time, you're going to have a totally different structure, provided you get a threshold number of platelets and all those other things. So
I just want to touch quickly, when you say the threshold number of platelets, people also who are going, perhaps, and I'm just picking a number out here, they go, I've only got 1,000 rand to spend, so I can do one treatment. That's not going to cut it, right? It's, depending on the case.
It depends on the system you use.
But okay, so
I think the generally accepted idea with PRP is it can do really good things if you get a threshold number of platelets. Okay. This is particularly in the context of PRP. There's a lot of discussion as to what that threshold number should be. Some people say it needs to be 1 billion platelets. Someone will say something else, and a third person will say something totally different. But for something like PRP, you may be in a situation where you process horse's blood, you get PRP. You could process that same horse's blood in 2 weeks' time and get a totally different product.
So you really need to let your vet guide you and follow their advice.
The best thing you can do is have a good vet advising you that you can trust and that has your horse's best interests at heart.
And follow and commit to the treatment protocol.
And commit to the treatment protocol. And often with things like PRP, you often know you potentially are in for more than just.
And you're not going to see an immediate. I think maybe that's the disappointment, right? As people go, well, I've done the PRP. Where's,
Exactly, where if you did, something more on the anti-inflammatory side, IRAP, A2M, ProStride, all those things, you'll see a difference much sooner. So that's why it sort of depends.
Have the right expectations, basically.
But I think what you said earlier about, how quickly you see a difference, we definitely see that, for instance, with Regenesis. I'd say around 70% of people see a difference after the first injection. But there is quite a big category of people who need that second injection in order to reach that threshold number of circulating growth factors.
So don't back off too soon either.
But also one of the reasons that's why we sell it with the Regenesis kit, the vets get to process 3 treatments at once. So we have some sort of assurity that if a horse is going to get 3 treatments, we're confident enough. Almost always by the second treatment, but worst case by the 3rd treatment.
It's also just
you should have a positive. You should have a really good.
It's a really clever company approach. It's just in this is it. You have to buy 3, and I think that's a very clever.
I think you give the horse the better chance that way, and that's what we've seen. And if the horse is healthier and happier, you have a healthier. No, you don't not a healthier owner, but you have a happier owner. And you have an even happier vet.
I think you have a healthier owner because they're going to drink less. It's going to be
exactly. It's going to be less stress.
Totally. Following on from that, what is the long-term outlook for sport horses that have undergone this regenerative therapy? And does it need to be an ongoing, like sometimes when we start with joint injections, now it's every 6 months, for the rest of their life?
I think the management of sports horses is an ongoing exercise. It's never ever a one and done. I've done it now. I'm done for the next 6 months. Don't come back to me.
I wish dieting was like that. I dieted yesterday. I'm done.
Yeah,
It's over.
exactly. If only it worked that way, wouldn't that be a wonderful world to live in? But I think success does vary, depending on the condition, the treatment, how soon the intervention could happen, all those sort of factors around the intervention we've discussed. And I think, on a case by case basis, I don't think one can really say with this you're going to see a difference in a week. And if only horses were.
And if only horses read the textbook, they're very rude.
That would make our lives so much easier, wouldn't it?
You can go and give your horse before you jump tomorrow. Say, this is the course. Please pay attention. Thank you. How can owners and trainers collaborate with their veterinary team to optimize the use of regenerative medicine in their horses?
I think the best thing any horse owner, trainer, person can do is recognize that prevention is better than cure, and not wait till the point where your horse is actually injured or has a problem in order to start managing them. I think going back to what we said earlier, I think the demands that are placed on sports horses in this day and age are far beyond what they were originally designed to do. And I think the best way to manage a problem is to prevent it in the first place. And not everything 100%. Is preventable. I think you have to accept it. But I stand very firmly in that a lot of problems are preventable. And quite interestingly, if you look where we lose majority of sports horses, it's between the ages of 7 and 10.
7
and 10 is where we lose majority of the racehorses. By the time they're 12 and have been going for a few years without any intervention, those are your more elite type athletes. And I think, in my opinion, the biggest disservice we do is not starting with horses as a 5 or a 6-year-old. In Europe, that's already what's happening.
That's interesting.
But again, sort of in more sort of the elite areas, not elite areas of the sport, that's the wrong way to say it, but with the people in the top of the sport, with your top sports vets,
they're a bit more progressive.
There's definitely a more progressive approach. So
I suppose, like you say, though, if they've already been playing with these therapies for 5 years, they're now seeing the proof.
Exactly. And, if you start with a horse, for instance, with a lot of these horses that are a little bit bigger, they weaken the stifles, they weak behind. That very quickly, if you don't address that, you're going to deal with 500 other. You're going to deal with 500 other problems. And then also you get to know where the horse's weaknesses are. And then with a really good vet that you work together with on an ongoing basis, which I think is the biggest thing I can recommend, you're in a much better place to assess when that horse is looking a little like it's struggling a little bit more than it usually does. And that is the absolute best place to intervene.
And I think you said earlier on, very casually, knowing your horse is so important. And at that first moment where you're going, that's probably where you need to begin on this journey.
I think my vet, if he's listening to this podcast, will be saying, Alexandra, if you get 500 other people calling me as often as you do.
Yeah,
but
don't you know.
But listen, touch wood, I'd say it's served me well. I think there's a few things we've prevented. There's about 500 others that were probably nothing. But you just need that one time to prevent something that could end up being catastrophic, and you've saved yourself so much time and energy, and most importantly, you've prevented something not so nice happening to your horse.
Alex, what is your website if people want to read up a little bit more about this?
So Regenesis Vet is owned by Novita, so either www.regenesisvet.com or www.novita-biotech.com.
Fantastic. Is there anything else you would like to say to anyone who's listening?
I think that's everything from my side, and thank you so much for having me here tonight.
We're so pleased.
I so enjoyed speaking about all these
that
things.
We got to have you in studio all the way from Cape Town, coming up here for Derby, one of the most exciting events of the calendar. So I'll be looking forward to seeing you go around with your chosen equine ambassador for the sport. And thank you so much for joining us. It's really been lovely.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me.
If you've just joined in, I'm winding up with Alexandra Miszweski, the CEO and founder of Novita Biotechnology and Regenesis Vet. We've been speaking about regenerative medicine, rather, in equines, in sport horses. It's just been fantastic. Really, so much information. Please go back and listen to this. And don't forget to join us again next week, Wednesday at 7 p.m. for our next South African Equestrian Federation podcast.